Hello, I'm Stephen Hough, and this is Living the Classical Life.
This interview took place in Steinway Hall in New York, where the greatest pianists in history chose their instruments for Carnegie Hall concerts. Named by The Economist as one of 20 living polymaths, British pianist, composer, and author Stephen Hough is a rare Renaissance man of our time. He has appeared with almost all of the major orchestras of the world, and in 2001 became the first classical performing artist to win a MacArthur Foundation Genius Fellowship. The diversity of your activities is what impresses me the most. You're an award-winning poet, you're a writer, you're a teacher, and I'm probably leaving out any number of your other disciplines. For example, I know that you recently displayed an art exhibition in London.
Well, of course, some of these things are very much things that I do privately and somehow people found out about and made them public, especially the paintings. This is something that's very, very personal, and I mean, no one saw them really. But I decided to use some images without crediting them on my website, and that's how the gallery owner in London saw them and asked who they were by, and then went on and could we do a show? And my instant reaction was no, and in fact the most terrifying moment of my life was going to the preview for that show and stepping in the door and seeing these things on the wall that I'd just seen at home, and now they were on a sort of big white wall in Notting Hill, with people looking at them and probably not with much, not very impressed in some ways. So that was pretty scary, but I think you get to a certain age when you don't care so much what people think about you, and that's one of the great things about getting older. When you're 20, it matters an awful lot what people think, because you have to pass exams, you have to win competitions, you have to impress managers and conductors, and I mean, not impress in a kind of self-conscious way, but it simply is the way that you have to live your life. If you apply for a job, however humble a job, you have to make some sort of an impression so that they say, yes, we'll hire you. But then, gradually, maybe those things matter less. I think it's just an ongoing process, but maybe just a little bit each time. Each time you have a failure, it seems perhaps a little bit less important than it did. Each time you have a success, it seems a little bit less really important than it did in the bigger picture of things. I think that sort of perspective of things that matter in life, you hope they change. And you know, I don't think there's ever such a thing as a progress like this. It's up and down and up and down. And the same with learning. I remember my piano teacher, my main piano teacher, Gordon Green, said many wise things. One thing was, he said, I don't care how you're playing now, it's how you're going to play in 10 years that interests me. So everything was towards a bigger picture, a longer goal. He could have sat there and said, do this, do that, groomed a performance, had it ready for a competition, but he didn't want to do that. He let things grow in an organic way. And the other thing he said was that we could stay a long time on a plateau and not to worry about that. But it was the work we did during that time on the plateau that enabled the next leap forward to happen. So we shouldn't expect every day we get a little bit better. And sometimes learning a piece, I'm sure you've had the same experience.
Oh, sure.
I mean, weeks after weeks, and it doesn't seem to get any better, at least for me.
I seem to always feel that way. Yes.
Then suddenly you turn a corner perhaps, and then things get a little bit easier. I remember this actually with the Brahms Quintet comes to mind. I just thought I would never get this piece in my fingers. It just didn't seem to stick. And then one morning, it just sort of fell into place a little bit more.
Do you ever worry about failure on stage?
I wish I had everything so mapped out that I could say, this is how I react in this situation. It's different every time. And sometimes when you're playing with an orchestra, I haven't played with every orchestra in the world, but sometimes when you're playing with an orchestra for the first time, it's a very nerve-wracking thing because you don't know anyone there. Yes. Other times you care less because, in a way, you don't know anyone there. Yes. Actually, a certain kind of, if people like you, that can have its own pressure, I've found.
Yes.
Because, you know, if an orchestra puts its trust in you and you go back for the 4th, 5th, 6th time, the 6th time you start to think, well, you know, you've been so wonderful to ask me back. I hope that it's still pleasing you in the way that it did the 3rd time I came. There's always this feeling that it could actually begin to go off. And I've seen this with conductors. You know, conductors can have a big success with an orchestra the first couple of times, and then somehow it goes off. The chemistry doesn't work when they come back again. And who knows why this happens. But I think the key to all of this is not to be too self-conscious about it. I mean, the worst thing is to just think, you know, am I a failure? Am I successful? You know, am I impressing you? It's like you have dinner with someone and you're constantly thinking, do you like me? Do you like me? You know, I mean,
Yes.
It's awful.
Yes.
Absolute death. You have to be yourself, realize that some people will like you, some people won't. Almost everyone has some friends in the world, but
Yes.
nobody has everyone as their friend. Some people like us, some people they don't.
Do you consciously aim to silence those critical thoughts on stage?
I do try to, if I find that they're coming in to my mind, then I do try to let them go. And there are all sorts of things that people have said over the years. I mean, I think there's some, you know, if the ground that you're standing on 1,000 years hence is never going to be recognizable anywhere in the world from now.
Yes.
So, you know, how important will this concert I'm playing tonight be in 1,000 years' time? Well,
Yes.
of no importance at all. Probably no importance in a year's time, really. So those things can help to put things into perspective. I remember someone once saying, if you imagine everyone in the audience is wearing no clothes, then you won't be nervous.
Do you ever use that?
I haven't tried it, really. I'm always too nervous to
I
try.
once tried. I was
Did
usually
you?
too nervous to try. Yes.
But, you know, we're all ants crawling on this beautiful but small planet, and so we shouldn't really get too worried about these things, I don't think.
Tell us about your teacher, Gordon Green. It seems his influence on your life was more than just musical.
I think it was, and my regret is that he died when I was about 18, so I only had him as a teenager. And in a way, he didn't teach people until they were 18. He was a college-age teacher, really, and I think I would have benefited so much more. The last year or so of our relationship, I was always calling him Mr. Green, and he said, I think now you can call me Gordon. I would much prefer that. He was a very open, unpompous sort of man, and that was a nice change of gear in a way. It was a way of, not exactly as a colleague, but it was a way of just making the relationship, you know, more warm and more friendly. And I often went to stay with him when he was living originally in Liverpool, and so it was easy for me to get to my lessons there. But then he moved to London. He always taught in London and Manchester, but he just found that he wanted to be closer to the job in London. And staying with him, you know, it was not just about music. It was,
Yes.
I mean, I remember him liking this particular soap opera called Emmerdale Farm. I think it's still running. It's not a very good show because he loved well, at least he said he loved the scenery and the beautiful Yorkshire moors and farmhouses and so on. I think he probably was more interested in the plot than he liked to admit. But his wife had been a dancer, and she was a wonderful woman, and, you know, and he would bring in coffee and freshly baked cakes, and he was a very rounded, warm-hearted, incredibly humble man. He was absolutely not interested in being a career teacher.
Yes.
He couldn't care less if his name were on your bio or not. In fact, I think he'd be rather embarrassed if why do you want that? No, you know, just... So it was very different from, I think, and it's not altogether their fault, but I think a lot of teachers now feel that they have to carve out a career, that they have to become famous
Yes.
teachers.
Yes.
And in a way, a teacher, the best teachers are the ones who disappear at the right moment. They give all their wisdom, and then when the boat is ready to be pushed out from the shore, where are they? They've gone. A little bit like a really good parent. All the support, all the nurturing, but there is a moment when you step back, and then your child has to live their own life. And it's very true with him. He felt very much like that.
When you were a young man, did you actually set out to do this many things?
Absolutely not. I mean, it was all I could do just to play the piano and to learn the repertoire. And I didn't do any of this really until after the MacArthur. The sort of irony of the MacArthur is that it was such a surprise when I got the phone call to say that I'd won it, that I sort of thought to myself, well, I suppose I better make myself worthy of this thing. I'm meant to be, you know, to have other interests apart from playing. No, I think in the early years, there is so much to do. There's so much repertoire to learn.
Yes.
And I think, you know, it's important to not to sort of diversify in the way that you dissipate
Yes.
your energies. So, and no one should ever feel that they have to do these things. Just should come naturally. And I've always written words for myself, and I've always sort of kept bits of diaries and written bits of poems.
Yes.
But I think there came a point when I just wanted to make it more orderly in a way. I think in some ways the computer and the internet and websites have made it more possible to gather things together. I've written now for my blog over 550 different little essays, some big, some small. I mean, when I started it, I thought I probably had about a dozen possibilities that I could write. You know, in fact, it was one of my worries was I wouldn't have enough to say. But it's funny that actually having it there and putting things up, things just come into my mind, and so I've done much more than I ever thought that I would be able to do. And you know, the same with composing. I wrote quite a lot of music when I was a kid and up to the age of about 20. But once I started a career, I didn't have time, and then I kind of was put off, and so I just wrote little encore pieces, and that was all. And then it was a snowball thing. I wrote a little piece in memory of a composition teacher I had, and someone heard that at the bassoon player of the Halle Orchestra and liked it and said, would I write him a bassoon concerto, which was a huge leap up from a little recorder piece that I'd written. And it was such an outrageous request that I thought, well, I'll see if I can do it. So I started sketching this piece, which eventually became the cello concerto, The Loneliest Wilderness, which Stephen Hough gave the premiere of. And actually, that was my first serious piece in 20 years. And since then, people heard that and wanted something else, and I wrote a piece for Westminster Cathedral, and then I ended up, it was done at the Abbey, and so the cathedral had something else, and then they asked for something else. So it's a kind of an ongoing thing, and there's in fact, I noticed just I was updating a website the other day, there's about 35 different works now that have been published over the last 10 years. So it's kind of gone a bit out of control. I don't really know where it all came from, but no, I don't think one should feel any pressure. I'm very keen on, whether it's with students, on relaxation, of people feeling loose and relaxed and never feeling under sort of
relaxation
stress.
in what sense?
I mean, physically, of course, you know,
Yes.
the muscles just don't work if you're tight in a particular kind of way.
Yes.
But also mentally, I really think that the brain will absorb more if you're not so anxious about things.
Are you still able to balance that against the pressures of deadlines and learning? I assume that you're quite fast in learning new scores.
Not really, no. I like to, I'm quite good at arranging a schedule for things. And
Yes.
I write down everything I'm playing at the moment by month.
Yes.
And I try to learn something a year before I have to play it in public. So it's usually ready long before the deadline, so that then I have the luxury of a little bit of room. I can't cram at the last minute. I can't do that. But I think with pressure, if I held a gun at you and asked me to tell me your mobile phone number,
Yes.
or your brain would, you might even not remember it. You know?
Yes.
But if I just ask you what it is, because I'd like to give you a call later, then you wouldn't have a problem doing it. And I think that there's some relation to that and learning things. If we feel this tremendous pressure all the time, then I think
Yes.
not only does the brain not work as well, but maybe it's not as creative either.
When I think of the world of Stephen Hough as I see it from the outside, I always associate, yes, a seriousness of intent, but also a certain lightness, wit, and humor. Where did this element of humor come from in your life? Were there certain influences early on from some of your teachers or perhaps your family?
I don't know, really. Actually, if you saw my school reports, I think you'd find those quite humorous because they were so bad. So maybe I had to develop I was thinking about this the other day because my school invited me to give the speech at the big end of year, well, not graduation, but it's called Founders Day, when they celebrate the founder of the school, which is back to the 15th century or 16th century. And I was just laughing about this because the headmistress is younger than I am, and so she has no idea how bad a student I was. And I thought, I couldn't do it actually, but I thought of getting out my school reports and actually doing a speech based on, could do better, never tries hard enough, a total failure in this, and everything else. I think only English was okay, but even then I wasted so much time. So I'm totally not the textbook example. You shouldn't. I mean, I watched 6 hours of television every night of the week.
That's amazing. How did you find time for that?
Well, I didn't do anything else, you see. I'd come home from school, did the minimum amount of work, and then from about 6:30, I'd settle down in front of the television, and I'd be there until midnight, really, just watching soap operas, police programs, Hawaii Five-0. I mean, the most absolute rubbish for year after year. So, But I did, of course, have to pick up the pieces later on. And I often wonder if I'd actually worked harder then, either whether I just have more repertoire now or whether I would have burnt myself out. We can never know.
I remember your recital in Cleveland in 2005. You played as an encore, an arrangement of the Delibes Pizzicato polka, and I remember there were these ladies who giggled. When was the first time you realized classical music could be funny?
Well, I think Shura Tchaikovsky really had this element of wickedness. I was actually a naughty at school. I mean, not in a dangerous and about, but I loved saying outrageous things and seeing if the teacher, I still do actually, but I won't do anything outrageous, you know, to see if how the teacher would react. I remember even at primary school, one teacher, I used to rush up when she came in the room, rush up to her and throw my arms around her and give her a big hug and then go back to my seat. And it was hard for her really to find this objectionable because it was a show of affection. But in another way, it was a sort of wanting to be naughty just to see how she would react. So I think playing the pizzicati of Delibes is my equivalent today of being naughty. I like to do things that are slightly risque. I don't know why.
So you've never shied away from controversial topics, especially on your blog. Did you ever expect that you would cause such a firestorm?
Well, I don't do it specifically to get people angry, but obviously certain topics to do, well, particularly with politics or religion are the two hot button issues, aren't they? And people do get very annoyed and passionate one way or the other about those. So, but actually everything I've tried to do on that blog with those issues is, it's really like a mantra in a way for me, is to try and find the points of agreement, because I'm kind of convinced that even on opposite sides of the fence, there's more areas that we can agree with than we realize.
Yes.
And that fascinates me, particularly with religious issues.
You in fact, wanted to be a priest when you were growing up, the same as Franz Liszt.
Well, I suppose similar, yes.
Yes.
How did this mission relate to your musical mission?
I was asking, I was saying I wanted to be a priest. I went to talk to various people, and they said, I think, you should be a priest at the piano, or, in fact, one priest here in New York, Father George Ruttler, I haven't seen him now for about 20 years, but he's a parish priest in one of the parishes here. Very cultivated, clever, wonderful man. And, but, he said, I think that, your piano is your altar, really.
Yes.
Which was surprising because, there's a shortage of priests, and you'd think if someone came forward and said, I want to be a priest, then, they'd be grabbed in and rushed through as quickly as possible. But I think he felt that, it was possible to do things in a different way. I mean, my own journey with my faith, my Catholicism, has changed in an enormous amount. I mean, I started from because I converted to Catholicism, and I started from a very conservative background, and over the years I've either become more broad-minded if you think it's a good thing, or I've backslid if you think it's a bad thing.
Yes.
But I'm not sure Father Ruttler would be so happy with our discussions now, but still that's something else.
Yes.
But I do think that, well, I remember one priest saying that he felt that he was a joy bringer. That was the thing that he felt about his life, whether it was dealing with difficult situations with people's bereavement or terrible illness, or whether it was literally when people were already joyful, that somehow a good priest is there to facilitate joy and to bring that kind of, not levity, but a deep kind of peace to people's lives. And I think we can do something similar.
What's the performer's relation to the political world? Does it have a place on the stage?
I think it's complicated. I think, first of all, I don't think the stage and the concert is the moment for this, because I'm very conscious that people in an audience come from many different backgrounds, and actually the more different backgrounds, for me, the better. I would hate a uniform audience of people who all agreed with me, even musically. So I don't think there's a right to do that. And actually, if you choose to visit a country, I also don't think that you're a visitor, you're a guest. I'm always very careful not to criticize places that I visit, because I don't think it's appropriate. If you go to someone's house, you don't say, I think that's a horrible picture on your wall. If you're offended enough by them, then you just don't go.
Right.
And so I suppose there would have been places I mean, historically, in the past, South Africa, when apartheid was in place, most people didn't go as a sort of protest, and that's one thing. Russia, I haven't been invited, so I haven't had to face that dilemma at the moment.
Question, right.
It's not the only place in the world where similar
and I think
anti-gay issues are taking place. I don't know, it's very difficult because I think it's important if you're in a position of any sort of public influence to use that for good things. But on the other hand, if you're an amateur politician and weigh in on some issues, I think very often you just don't see the full picture. And you don't see the pressures behind certain political decisions. You know, even in the West, certain people make decisions that we don't know why they make those. There are all sorts of pressures, and some of them, of course, are wrong pressures. Maybe they're financial issues that people are scared of losing a contract for a lucrative deal, and that shouldn't be the reason to abuse human rights. But sometimes there are moments when people do something that in a bigger picture may actually end up being better for human rights, but we just can't see it for that 6-month slot. So, no, I'm cautious. I'm much more interested in finding the things that unite than I am in finding, you know, things that divide and things that are full of controversy.
Let me bring you to a different subject.
Young musicians face such an image-driven classical music world today. How has this changed since the time when you were growing up?
Well, we are on the stage. A concert is theatre, and this is one reason why I'm less enthusiastic about concerts which abandon all formality and become someone in a torn pair of jeans chatting to the audience. I think there's a place for that kind of event. But there's also a place for 5 minutes past 8, lights down, hushed hall, Carnegie Hall, someone walking out from the wing, sitting at the piano, silence, music starting. I think there's something wonderful, dramatic, exciting, thrilling still about the traditional concert. So I don't think that merely by making it informal, we're going to attract a lot more people to come. But on the other hand, I think that there can be a false kind of image. I think there can be an artificial kind of image. I'm not sure it's anything so modern, because we hear of, I can't remember who I was reading of, which, was it Anton Rubinstein, who would come onto the stage with a top hat and a cloak and drape it on, you know, and it was a very big kind of theatrical thing. And Liszt certainly understood about the theatre.
Liszt and Paderewski, who we have.
Completely. And you know, and various Chopin's lemon-coloured gloves, and so this is nothing new. I think it's just as long as it doesn't become the main focus. I think that's one of the dangers today, and particularly perhaps for record companies. I actually had this experience myself with one, this is about 15, 20 years ago now, but one major record company was interested in a project. And we had discussions and it was all going ahead, but the person involved said, well, before we can do any more, it has to go to the marketing department. And I warn you, they have no knowledge of music at all. But so it went to the marketing department, they looked through the material, didn't feel they could do anything with me and that particular repertoire, so the project didn't happen. Now that's fine, but I think that's the problem. I think if you have someone who you believe in musically and then you can find a way of doing something interesting with marketing, then I think that's great, you know, and why not?
You recently recorded the List Sonata for iPad. Tell me about that project.
Well, I was approached about this. This is a sort of Apple-sponsored series of projects with a company called Touch Press. And they did an award-winning one on The Wasteland of T.S. Eliot, where they take the poem and they have a number of actors reading it. They have the original typescript with all of the corrections and with Ezra Pound's commentary, and you can get behind the scenes. Every single word will link to as a sort of thesaurus to other Eliot writings. And so it's an absolute in-depth examination of that poem from every possible angle. And then they did one on the elements, they did one on some sketches of Leonardo, the cartoons, they did various other ones, the sonnets of Shakespeare, and then they did one on the symphony with Esa-Pekka Salonen and the Philharmonia Orchestra, where they examined the orchestra with some major scores. And then they wanted to do the piano, and I was approached about this, and was there something that came to mind? And I just thought the List Sonata was the perfect piece for all sorts of reasons, because it's a nice length. It's half an hour. It's one work. It appeals to the emotions in a very, very strong way, but also to the intellect. There's enough to talk about there. It's the center of the 19th century, 1853. It's also the year that Steinway piano began. So it kind of ticks a lot of boxes if you wanted to find something that would represent the piano. So we ended up recording it. And then I did about 20 little talks about snippets, about aspects to it. I even played the original ending, which List abandoned, which was originally a loud, flashy ending.
I've only heard about it, so I better...
You'll see it on there.
I better see it at the end of the program.
It's quite dreadful, but it's amazing what a lapse of judgment it would be. Because, of course, those final 2 pages are so magical. But, yeah, it ends with big chords and just sort of very bombastic.
There's a fair amount of loneliness on the road. How do you deal with it as a traveling musician?
Well, within limited amounts, I love it. I love the loneliness. I don't like the travel. I don't like airports and planes and taxis and all of that side of it. But
Yes.
I do like the time alone, and I would really feel bad if I was never alone. I'm an only child. My father was an only child, so I don't have a big family. I don't have lots of... So I'm not used to households full of laughter and craziness and rows and all of that. So I like that time alone. It's my time to read when I'm on the road. I find it hard to read at home because there's always so many other things to do. So I enjoy that.
You have so many artistic activities, and yet you still find time to teach. Is that part of your mission artistically?
Now this is where the balloon is about to fall to the ground because I do so little, Joel. I mean, I do have these positions.
Yes.
And I've said to both places, maybe I shouldn't continue because I go in, well, in a good year, one day.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's not much of a sacrifice of, no. I would love to do more because I do think that I love working with talented young people, and it's thrilling when you say something which actually helps. You know, it's incredible. It's a bit like being a doctor. You know, you give someone a pill and suddenly they're better and they're so happy. And so I like that side of it. But no, I don't actually have any students. Although interestingly, this week in New York, I did hear 2 very talented young people who had made a special request over a number of months. And finally, I was here in New York and I said, okay, let's find an hour each. So I did that. But I think the responsibility of having students is great, and I don't feel that I can give that kind of time. So I'm happy to hear occasionally someone, but on a regular basis, it's just not really possible.
What do you tell young musicians who are trying to find their own voice?
Well, I would certainly like to, I mean, that would be a priority, would be to get someone to trust themselves.
Yes.
And as we said earlier, you know, to relax. You know, the piano is not going to bite. Just really and I think then when you relax, you start to discover your own personality. I don't think being an individual, being original is about looking for originality. It's about allowing yourself to blossom. Because I think everyone has original ideas. Everyone is completely different. That's what's so amazing about human life, and what's so particularly awful about totalitarian states is this idea that you try and make everyone as similar as possible. Whereas I think the great experiment in the country where we are now is that people had the confidence to allow people to be individuals and to make their own paths. I mean, granted, there was enough space geographically to do that in a way, but that's just fantastic, and that has been such a success over the hundreds of years, and continues to be the ideal that I think all of us now see. And I think that's true in music too, is just allowing people to be themselves. And I think there's a certain sort of teaching which is always reining people in or saying, no, that's bad, or that's bad. And obviously there are things that are bad, and the point of teaching isn't to say everything's wonderful and to make suggestions, but I'm always conscious, especially suggestions about things to do with musical taste, of always leaving a door open and always feeling, well, you know, this is an idea, but you know, if you don't want to do it, then don't. And because I don't have students that I see every week, it's much easier, because I can give all these ideas and then I leave the room and leave town and they can forget it all if they want, and I won't be offended.
Did you go through your musical life always
feeling like you had to be successful at any given moment?
I don't think so. My parents were very easygoing about. I think that their prime concern was that I was happy, and if I'd given up music, I don't think they would have been too bothered, really. They wouldn't have liked it if I'd become a priest. I think that's the one thing. Actually, I think there was an element of rebellion on my part.
Yes.
Because my grandmother, my mother's side of the family, comes from a very staunch Liverpool stroke Northern Irish, Scottish,
Yes.
Protestant background. And, you know, people picked up stones and threw it at each other, even in the 20th century, on different sides of the fence. So there was a certain rebellion when I told my grandmother that I was going to Mass. And she said,
Yes.
well, I will never speak to you again if you become a Catholic, she said. But she did, and in fact it was all fine, and I rather wickedly brought her back a rosary from Fatima once, which she then hung on her cabinet in her bedroom, and was fine. She also had a sense of humor about things, but so it's partly that kind of rebellion. But no, I don't think I felt the pressure of success. I think I just want to be able to pay my bills.
Yes.
And eat. I think, honestly, there's an
That's
element.
inspiration in itself.
Isn't it true that really, if you have clothes, and I'm 51, I can probably manage with the clothes I have to the end of my life. I can't manage with the food in my fridge until the end of my life, but as long as I have enough for that, and, you know, for a certain amount of enjoyment of different kinds of chocolate and odds and ends of things, I think that would be pretty good, in a way.
You've already achieved so much in your artistic life. Is there anything left yet to do in your dreams?
I don't think particularly. There are more pieces I want to learn. I do want to begin to play some Bach. I've not played any Bach professionally at all. Well, the very first year I played the G major toccata, a few small concerts, but I've never quite wanted to, and I now do a little bit. I'm not sure publicly, but I'd like to make some recordings. So that's something I'm looking into. There's a lot more music I want to write.
Yes.
I'm just finishing a song cycle at the moment.
The Indianapolis Symphony recently performed a choral work of yours.
Yes, they premiered,
Yes.
actually commissioned the orchestrated version of a mass, which Missa Mirabilis, which the Colorado Symphony are going to record next year for Hyperion.
Congratulations.
So that will be fun. And Stephen Islis did my cello sonata just 2 weeks ago, which I wrote for left hand and cello. So we're recording that at the end of this year as well. So yeah, there are lots of other compositional things. And I'd love to try and write a novel, so that's something. But just bit by bit, I don't have a big long list of things I want to do. I'm just taking each thing and maybe you've got some ideas. What should I do next?
Yes, we'll have to be in touch.
Actually, the fact that you said my young life
Yes.
instantly made me feel full of optimism. So.
Well, there was this famous old Horowitz quip which claimed that there were 3 types of pianists. I'm sure you know this. He said, either Jewish, gay, or bad. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I've known some who were all 3. So I don't know about that.
Yes.
And of course, some who are none of the 3. Some
Right.
good ones who were. Well, I think, obviously, it's not true, but
Yes.
one could say that...
Is there a connection between one's personal life and the artistic output?
I think that what perhaps, and historically, and of course this is changing now in the 21st century, but I think historically being Jewish or being gay was being an outsider in some way, was not being part of the group, the sort of the inner kind of conventional way of doing things. And so I think that makes people express themselves sometimes in more powerful ways. And I think certainly traditionally with Jewish people, I just saw part of a wonderful documentary on the history of the Jews by Simon Schama, in which he talks about the Jewish people as always having the suitcase ready to go because they never knew when they'd have to leave town because of another persecution or whatever it was. And I think that, of course it binds a community together in a particular way, but it also, I think, if not the suitcase, the violin case.
Yes.
And this, I think, is something that's so rich in Jewish tradition.
Is that feeling of being an outsider part of the artistic life?
I think so, and being not conventional.
Yes.
You know, the last thing you want to be as an artist is just following all the rules.
Yes.
It's just being part of the sort of the status quo of the conventions. And so I think that's something which Jewish people have faced, and also that gay people have faced.
Yes.
And I think historically with gay people in the past, they were often part of the theatre,
Yes.
the kind of outrageousness. I think some of my outrageousness was partly this. It was a way of expressing something of that.
Yes.
You know, the extreme camp thing is
campiness,
also
yes.
is part of that. And of course, if you were going to be arrested for being gay, then you found these quirky ways of doing it to the very edge. And I think a lot of people express this through music. And you hear in someone like Horowitz or in someone like Joukowsky, you know, the deep emotional confusion there,
Yes.
really. You know, I mean, neither of them, I think, were without intimate experiences, but on the other hand, it wasn't a normal part of their life. Now, the interesting thing is in the 21st century, now that in most parts of the world, gay people, well, in most of the Western world, gay people don't have to hide anymore.
Right.
And thank goodness Jewish people are not being driven out from one town to the next. Maybe this will change, and maybe another group will become the sort of outsiders who find a way, the fuel really for their artistic endeavors in this way. So we'll see. But
My last question for you is, what's a moment of bliss for you, Stephen Hough?
I think there are certain pieces, well, actually three I can think of in particular that I've played in public where I've sensed something not just of beauty, I don't mean in the way I'm playing it, but in the actual content of the music, but something reaching beyond that to another dimension. And one was, and they're very obvious places in a way. One was the second movement of Opus 111 of Beethoven, and I have experienced playing that, a feeling of tears in my eyes, not through emotion, but through a kind of elevated spiritual presence, if you like. The same with the B-flat sonata of Schubert, the slow movement of that. I think when the theme comes back in the major, and it's even more sad than it is in the minor, that's a very special, something that Schubert does a lot, of course, is turn the major into something melancholy and not tragic, but incredibly emotionally deep. And then the Brahms second concerto, the moment, the più adagio, just sort of around the middle with a duet with the clarinets.
Yes.
There's something in that page, and then when it goes to the strings, the triple P, that I've sometimes had to force myself not to be too involved. Because, of course, if you're too involved, you physically can't play anymore. You have to stop.
That's interesting.
And so you really sometimes can't, if you like, enjoy the indulgence of being in this contemplative space, because you are, in the end, there for the audience. You're there to transmit this piece, and if you can no longer transmit it, then your job has failed. So, actually, sometimes at the end of slow movements, you have to pull yourself out of that spirit quite ruthlessly, in a way.
Yes.
The same is true of the first Brahms concerto. At the end of the slow movement, you play the trill, and then the orchestra continue with the sort of chorale. I find that from the moment I finish the trill, I, of course, want to stay in this serene mood with the orchestra, but inside, I'm already thinking, yum, da, da, yum, bum, because I have to move on to that. I can't enjoy being in the clouds because we're back, you know, we've got something else to do. So it's almost painful, that, because you want to stay there. You want to finish the movement and just, you know, spend the time.
It was such a pleasure to have you here,
Sure.
Stephen.
Great pleasure for me too.
Thank you so much.